Okay, so I had someone was asking me a question about the oracles of God, their usage in the Old Testament and the New Testament. This kind of touches on the idea that we need to ask questions as the church. How do we deal with the Old Testament versus the New Testament? How do we deal with how they're interrelated? How do we define that relationship? How do we explore that relationship? Is there a relationship that will actually inhibit your ability to rightly interpret the text, or on the opposite, which is what we're hoping for? Is there an understanding of that relationship that will actually cause your interpretation of the text to flourish? I would argue and say that yes, there is a relationship between the Tanach, the Old Testament, and the New Testament, Brit, haKhadashah, and I think that understanding this relationship will lead to better or worse exegesis. So, for a start, the way I like to think of it is first off, I would say that I would put it all into the category of that Paul would, which is haGraphon, the writings. So that which is written, I would say that which is written, the writings, I'm totally fine. I'm amening the 66 books that are canonized. Those are the writings. Great. They are equally all 66 books. Now here's the question. All books of the Bible are authoritative in the life of a disciple, a follower of Messiah. Here's a funny question though. While they're equally authoritative, is the way that their authority functions identical to each other? And here's what I mean by that. Is each book of the Bible, and let's just start with the Old Testament, for example, Malachi. Is Malachi authoritative in the way that Deuteronomy is? And here's partly what I mean by that. Think about functional authority. The authority of the prophets is entirely derivative. No prophet that speaks in the name of Yahweh and then has a writing associated with it. And as a side note, we know from Kings and Chronicles, and even from some of the prophets themselves, that there are prophecies that are revealed that are not written. So you can be a prophet without writing, but that which is written, the call to speak in the name of Yahweh, you derive that authority to write down prophecy from the Torah. So that the first 5 books of Moses are self-referential. They plot from heaven is the kind of way, the way that their origin is told in the Tanakh itself, in the Old Testament. The Torah comes from heaven by the hand of Moses. It's self-referential. It does not derive its authority from anything other than the direct revelation of Yahweh to the people of Israel by the hand of Moses. Whereas the prophets, and you know this from Deuteronomy 13, right? Test and false prophets, like you can't contradict the Torah. So the functional authority of the prophets, its authority, Isaiah is just as authoritative in the life of a believer as Deuteronomy is. However, because Isaiah's authority is derivative from the Torah, we have to understand Isaiah's words, speech, and authority in light of that which was revealed beforehand through the lens of the Torah. And so that will change the way we interpret the book. I would say that in a way you can say that the writing, and this is a little bit anachronistic, and it's not this because I'm driving making this video. The the writings derive their authority from the prophets, and the prophets derive their authority from the Torah. Or you could say, because some of that's not exactly contemporaneous, you could say that the writings derive its authority from the Torah as well as the prophets deriving their authority from the Torah. But this idea of dividing the Tanakh into 3 categories, I mean, that's where the word Tanakh comes from. It's an acronym for Torah, Navim, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the writings. You see a threefold division in the New Testament in Luke, when Yeshua says he walked the 2 disciples of the road to Emmaus through the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. But I suspect that in the Second Temple period, in a lot of places, it was only a 2-fold division: the Torah and the prophets. And you can even see in the way that the Jewish delineation of how these books work, they will put certain books in the writings and not in the prophets for certain kind of theological reasons. The example is Daniel is in the writings, and the Jewish rendering of the Tanach, but we think of him as a prophet. So a twofold division is fine, just the Torah and the prophets. And so in that sense, you could say all of the writings are encapsulated in this twofold division, the Torah and the prophets. And that's probably what Yeshua meant when he used a phrase like that, the Torah and the prophets. And so that means the prophets derive their authority from the Torah. Well, Matthew 5:17 is a linchpin for this kind of argument that I'm making. Yeshua says he did not come to abolish the Torah and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them, to bring them to their fulfillment, to realize them, to manifest them. And so in a weird way you can say, well, what's this weird guy, Yeshua the Messiah, what's this weird guy, Yeshua the Messiah, doing? And where does he get his authority? And what's his agenda? And Yeshua the Messiah's answer would be, oh, I didn't set my agenda. It's already set by the Torah and the prophets, because my job is to actually bring them to pass. Now, what that means is the Messiah is subservient to the agenda of the Torah and the prophets. I would argue that the Gospels that are written about him, that testify to his life, because his life was subject to the agenda of the Torah and the prophets, this functional authority continues onward, so that if you really want to understand Yeshua, you've got to go back to the prophets, which if you really want to understand the prophets, you've got to go back to the Torah, and vice versa. And this is incessant in the ministry of Yeshua, so that you really don't understand what he means, what he says, what he does, without the Torah and the prophets. And this is especially problematic because Yeshua said that part of his ministry is to be in fulfillment of Psalm 78, is to speak in parables, to be a living parable of the history and life of Israel. So he speaks in parables, that fulfills Isaiah 6. His whole ministry is kind of to be tricky and to speak in riddles. And it means that you need to have the correct cipher in front of you to decipher Yeshua the Messiah. And part of the cipher is going to be the Torah and the prophets, which is why you see so many you'll see so many Gentile Christians just kind of wreck this project of the Messiah because they excise or like amputate the Old Testament functionally. They'll almost think of the Old Testament the way that maybe humans think about the appendix. It's vestigial. It's this thing that can be cut out and we'll still live without it. We'll still survive without it. We don't really know how it works, but we needed it at some point in the past, and we don't really anymore, and it's still with us. That is not the Old Testament. And as an example, now that you can talk about the oracles, Paul, the apostle, when he wants to settle an issue in new covenant churches that he has planted as an apostle of the Messiah, he quotes from the writings. He quotes from the writings to establish key new covenant church practices. A key example is this issue of should apostles be paid? Should these Spirit-appointed Ephesians 4:11 apostles receive some kind of material return from their labor? And he says yes. And how does he establish that, and how does he prove that? Oh, Deuteronomy says don't muzzle an ox when it treads the grain. He establishes new covenant practice. And what's incredible is the church in Corinth, while it had a strong Jewish presence, we know that because Sosthenes co-authored it. He's a synagogue ruler, and we can tell from reconstructing based on Acts that it was just the churches in Achaia, in that region of Corinth, were very well connected with the synagogues and the Jewish community. So it had a strong Jewish community and presence, but there definitely were Gentiles among them. And so he expects that argument to settle it for all people, that the oracles that were given in the form of Moses writing about an ox not being muzzled when it treads the grain is how we derive church praxis and arrangement. And he does this incessantly in Corinthians. Actually, you can, that was a 9, but if you wanted to, you could say start in 8, and you'll see how he quotes Psalm 24 to silence the argument about eating food sacrificed to idols, like when he wants to establish it. 9 is this about the ox treading the grain. And 10, he literally talks about how our fathers passed through the cloud And he says that the Israelites who went out in the Exodus and yet still died, he uses them as an example and literally says everything was written beforehand was written for our instruction. And he says that our fathers, and so that's he handles it there. In 11, he'll determine praxis again with the text. He seems to be alluding to Isaiah 6 and to the priests covering their head and for why women should cover their head. There are all kinds of allusions. He quotes Genesis in regards to wives covering their heads and this kind of thing. So when he establishes church praxis, he uses the oracles as a means of revealing how the New Covenant churches are to be arranged. So this is a quick and dirty little video that I wanted to make in terms of how does the church understand the relationship with the New Testament and the Old Testament in particular. How does it understand this constant reference in the New Testament to the oracles of God, the writings that were given beforehand as a means of kind of dictating arrangement, and it absolutely dictates arrangement. I would challenge people to find a Pauline command regarding church praxis that when it's in question in his letters, he doesn't validate it and prove it with the Tanach, with the Torah, the prophets. So that's how he thinks the writing should be used. He doesn't appeal to new and the 1 Corinthians 9 argument is a really powerful one, because here's this new thing that the Messiah instituted called apostleship. And so certainly Paul could just have the authority as the apostle of Yeshua to just kind of self-referentially say, well, this ruling in the church is just based on my apostleship with Yeshua, and without reference to the Torah, the prophets. But he doesn't do that. That's not how he understands this. And a really powerful way to argue that is a kind of major to minor argument. If the Messiah's life had to be subject to the Torah and the prophets, how much more so the Messiah's servants, the Messiah's followers, the Messiah's disciples? And that's a kind of rabbinical argument, a major to minor rabbinical argument, especially working for your hierarch to the inferiors. We are all disciples of Messiah. If he had to do this, so too do we. Yeshua makes arguments like this about himself. He says, if they call the master of the house Beelzebub, what are they going to do to you? The underlings, the servants. So if Messiah has made himself subject, made his agenda subject to the Torah and the prophets, how much more should Messiah's followers make their agenda subject to the Torah and the prophets and the churches? So it's the second watch. Gotta go. Bless you guys. Bye.